Hey guys, so let's talk about the nervous system, specifically the sensory and the motor tracts of the spinal cord. So we know that, millions of sensory neurons are going to be delivering information to the central nervous system all the time, right? All at once, right? We have a lot of information going to our central nervous system, which again, our central nervous system consists of our brain and our spinal cord. A lot of information is going on to this central nervous system all at once, right? And then there's millions of motor neurons that are causing the body to respond in a variety of ways, right? So we have sensory and motor neurons that's going to travel by different tracks, or almost different highways, if you will, within the spinal cord. Okay, so when we're excuse me, when we're looking at the organization and patterns of the spinal cord tracks, right, these highways, right, communication is going to involve sensory and motor tracks. So we're going to have ascending tracks. This is going to deliver sensory information to the brain. And then we have descending tracks. And this is going to deliver motor information to the peripheries, right? So coming from the central nervous system to the peripheries, okay? And again, these tracks, these are just neurons, right? Just axons extending through the spinal cord, extending out to the peripheries, okay? It's part of a neuron. Now, the processing usually occurs at several points along a track, whereas synapses, right? These synapses are going to relay signals from one neuron to the next, right? So a synapse is, again, wherever a neuron is talking or communicating with another type of cell. And the number of synapses will vary from one track to the next, right? So in general, these tracks are paired bilaterally and symmetrically along the spinal cord, and the axons within each track are going to be grouped according to the body region where they're innervating. And all the tracks involve the spinal cord and the brain. Now, when we're naming these tracks, we got to be specific. So if the name begins with spino, you can see right here, spino, it must start in the spinal cord and it ends in the brain. So if it begins with spino, the name begins with spino, it's going to start in the spinal cord and that track is going to end in the brain, right? So therefore, it must carry sensory information. Examples being the spinocerebellar tract, right? Originating in the spinal cord, and its destination is going to be in the cerebellum. The spinothalamic tract, again, originating in the spinal cord, however, its destination is the thalamus. Okay, so it's really in the words, right? Now, if the name ends with spinal, the track must start in the brain and end in the spinal cord. Therefore, it must carry motor information. Okay, so the corticospinal tract, right, originating in that cerebral cortex, and its destination is going to end in the spinal cord. Or even the vestibulospinal tract, originating in the vestibular nuclei and ending in the spinal cord, okay? So we have two tracks we mentioned, right? Sensory and motor tracks. When we're looking at the sensory tracks, we have sensory receptors that's going to monitor conditions both inside the body and in the external environment. So when these sensory receptors are stimulated, right? So a receptor passes information to the central nervous system. That's called a sensation, right? And these sensations arrive in the form of an action potential in an afferent sensory fiber. Okay. Now, most of the processing of sensory information occurs in the spinal cord, the thalamus, and the brainstem. However, around 1% of the information is going to be provided by those afferent fibers. It's going to reach the cerebral cortex in our conscious awareness. Now, when we're looking at the sensory tracts, there's going to be three main sensory tracts. We have the posterior columns, right? They're going to carry fine touch, pressure, and proprioceptive, like position sensations, right? We have the spinothalamic tract. That's going to carry poorly localized sensations of touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. And we have the spinocerebellar tract. And that's going to carry sensations to the cerebellum concerning the position of our muscles, our tendons, our joints, things like that. And all three of these tracts are going to be called somatosensory tracts. And you can see just on the spinal cord here where those tracts are located. Okay, we have the posterior columns, just like how it is, the posterior portion of the spinal cord and the posterior columns, right? The spinocerebellar tracts are going to be on the most lateral, portions of the spinal cord, and we have the spinal thalamic tract, and it's going to be one of the tracts is going to be on the lateral portion, one of the tracts are going to be in the anterior portion, but we'll look at that, right? So for neurons to communicate, right, in these tracts, we have first order, second order, and third order neurons in these ascending tracts, okay? And so these sensory tracts delivering somatic sensory information to the sensory cortex of the cerebral or cerebellar hemispheres, they're going to involve a chain of neurons, right? So you can see this first order neuron coming in here, right? Providing that sensation, that somatic sensation from, for example, from the right side of the body that we can see right here. Now it's going to come into the spinal cord via that dorsal root ganglia, right? So that sensory information, right, is going to come in from the back, right, or the dorsal portion of the spinal cord, okay? And so that first order neuron, a first order neuron is going to be that sensory neuron that delivers the sensation to the central nervous system, right? So it's going to come from the peripheries and deliver that sensory sensation to the central nervous system. So its cell body is going to lie within that dorsal root ganglion or cranial nerve ganglion. So you can see this is the cell body of that first order neuron. Now, first order neuron comes in, right, to the spinal cord, and then will synapse with a second order neuron, right? So the second order neuron is going to be right here, as you can see right here, the white one, right? So this is the first synapse, right? The first synapse, right? And so the second order neuron, so the axon of the first order neuron synapses on a second order neuron, and the second order neuron cell body may be located in either the spinal cord or the brain stem. So remember, in the spinal cord we have that gray matter, so that's where a lot of those cell bodies would be at there. And then we have this second order neuron that is synapsing with this third order neuron that you can see right here. This third order neuron is going to originate in that thalamus. Now, before we get to the third order neuron, so in most cases, the axon of either the first order or the second order neuron, they're going to cross over to the opposite side of the spinal cord or the brainstem as it then ascends upward, right? And so this crossing over is called decussation. And so sensory information from the right side of the body is delivered to the left side of the brain and vice versa, right? So you can see right here, the second order neuron is crossing over, right? So going from one side to the other side. And so when we're talking about the third order neuron, right, in tracts ending in the cerebral cortex, the second order neuron synapses on a third order neuron in that thalamus, okay? And so the axon of the third order neuron carries the sensory information from the thalamus to the appropriate sensory area of the cerebral cortex, okay? And so when we're looking at the posterior columns, right, the also called like the dorsal column medium lemniscus pathway, right? So, excuse me. This is going to consist of the gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus tracts. So more medial, right, we have that gracile fasciculus tract, and more lateral, we have that cuneate fasciculus tract, right? And so they're going to be able to carry fine touch or conscious proprioception, right? So knowing where you are in your own space, and it's going to monitor muscle spindles and Golgi bodies in your muscles. Okay, so what this is, we have two tracts, right? So for the fasciculus gracile, right, the most medial portion, that tract, that is going to carry sensory information coming anywhere below or inferior to T6, right, over your spinal cord, as compared to the cuneate fasciculus pathway, right, this one over here, that's going to carry information, sensory information, right to your brain, all that sensory information that is going to be superior to your T6. Okay, so anything above T6 is coming through this pathway. Anything below T6 is going to be coming through the gracile fasciculus pathway. Okay, and again, you can see here on our table down here, right, we're going to have a first order, a second order, and a third order neuron. Okay, and a third order neuron. And again, these are just carrying proprioception, fine touch, pressure, vibrations from your body, right? Again, gracile fasciculus is carrying that information inferior to T6, right? Whereas the cuneate fasciculus is carrying information up your spinal cord superior to T6, right? And they all have a final destination where it's going to be in the primary somatosensory cortex on the side opposite of that stimulus, okay? And they're going to decussate too. They're going to cross over. So we're going to have some crossing over in this pathway. So the axons of the second order neurons are going to cross over before joining the medial lemniscus pathway. Okay. And here you can see right here, first order come in, right? Second order, they're going to cross over in that medulla oblongata, right? To cross over to that medial lemniscus pathway. And then that second order will synapse with a third order neuron in the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, that third order neuron will synapse to the appropriate area in the primary somatosensory cortex. Then we have the spinal thalamic tract. So we have the lateral and the anterior spinal thalamic tract. The lateral one is going to be on the most lateral portion, as you can see right there. The anterior one is going to be more anterior. So the lateral spinal thalamic tract is going to carry pain and temperature sensations, right? So this is, again, going to be important in pain and temperature, sending that information about pain and temperature, okay? And so the anterior spinal thalamic tract, that's going to be important for sending information about crude touch, right? So pressure-based touch, right? And those type of sensations. And again, they're going to have a primary, secondary, and third order neuron, okay? And so here that we can see, so let's look at the lateral spinal thalamic tract. So we have that first order neuron coming in that's telling us, giving us information about pain and temperature sensations from the, for example, this one is from the right side of the body, right? Right when that first order neuron gets into the spinal cord, it's going to synapse with the second order neuron right here. And that second order neuron is going to cross over immediately to the other side. And then it's going to ascend via that lateral spinal thalamic tract all the way up to the thalamus, and then it's going to synapse with a third order neuron in the thalamus to get to the primary somatosensory cortex. Whereas the anterior spinal thalamic tract, so again, first order neuron synapses with the second order is going to cross over immediately. However, it's going to go up the anterior spinal thalamic tract, synapse in the thalamus, and then send that information to the primary somatosensory cortex. We have the spinal cerebellar tracts, right? The spinal cerebellar tracts, they're going to be on the most lateral portions of the spinal cord. So we're going to have both the posterior spinal cerebellar tract and the anterior spinal cerebellar tract, right? So they're going to be important in sending unconscious proprioception, and they're going to go to the cerebellum. So the final destination of these spinal cerebellar tracts is going to be the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is there for proprioception and balance. So basically knowing where you are in your own space and your balance, right? And so the dorsal or the posterior spinal cerebellar tracts, right? That's going to take information. So let's look at it right here, actually. The dorsal or the posterior spinal thalamic tract, right? That's going to take information from the same side as it comes in and bring it to straight up to your brain, to the cerebellum, as you can see right here, right? Going through the pons, getting to the cerebellum, all right? Whereas the ventral or the anterior, I should say, spinal cerebellar tract, that's going to bring information in, throw it to the other side, as we can see crossing over, and then bring it up, right? And then we're going to throw it back over to the other side, right, before it reaches the cerebellum, okay? And so, again, these are having proprioceptive input from your Golgi tendon organs, your muscle spindles, and your joint capsules, right? So it seems to be that the posterior or the dorsal spinal cerebellar tracts, they send information during movement, right? And so the anterior or the ventral spinal cerebellar tracts, they seem to send information about that movement, Okay. Okay, so remember that, right? And those were the three the three sensory tracts. And so we have motor tracts, right? So motor tracts will transmit motor commands, right, in response to that sensory information. So we're going to have descending tracts. So motor tracts are going to be these descending tracts. So they're going to go down the spinal cord, right? So motor commands are going to be delivered by the somatic nervous system, right? That's going to direct contraction of your skeletal muscles, right? Um, and we have autonomic nervous system, right? Motor commands, and that's going to direct the activity of glands, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscles, things like that. Okay. So when we're looking at the organization of our motor tracts, right, or our motor efferent descending tracts, so let's remember that. Okay. Um, our somatic motor tracts always involve at least two motor neurons. So we have an upper motor neuron, okay, whose cell body is going to lie within the central nervous system, and a lower motor neuron that we can see right here, located in a motor nucleus of the brainstem or the spinal cord, right? So activity in the upper motor neuron excites or inhibits that lower motor neuron. So the axon of the lower motor neuron extends to skeletal muscle fibers, and it's only capable of exciting skeletal muscle fibers, okay? And that's going to be in response to that first order neuron telling it to excite or not to excite, right? Or I'm sorry, that first order neuron that's going to excite or inhibit that second order neuron. But remember, that second order neuron, or that lower motor neuron, I should say, only has the ability to excite skeletal muscles, right? And again, this is somatic motor tracts, right? So we have conscious awareness of moving our muscles, right? So if any signal is going to the cortex or coming from the cortex, you'll be consciously aware of it, right? And so here we see again the upper motor neurons that's going to lie within a motor cortex, the primary motor cortex. And we can have the first synapse, right, or a synapse with a lower motor neuron in the brainstem that's going to go to skeletal muscles, or we can have a synapse with a lower motor neuron in the spinal cord that would then go to direct skeletal muscle movement, okay? In our visceral motor nuclei in the hypothalamus, right, we have the upper motor neuron there, and again, we can have a second or lower motor neuron coming from the brainstem that's going to synapse, or we can have a second motor neuron from the spinal cord that's going to synapse with a visceral effector. Now, the cortical spinal tract, right? These are also called those pyramidal tracts. This is coming from the brain for conscious movement, right? So we're providing conscious, voluntary control over skeletal muscles, okay? And so it's going to consist of three pairs of descending tracts. We have the cortical bulbar tract, which is going to be important here, as you can see. That's going to be important for conscious control over your eyes, jaw, face muscles, things like that. And so they're going to decussate, or they're going to cross over in the brainstem, so high up there, and it's going to control skeletal muscles of your face that we just mentioned. Now we have the lateral corticospinal tract, as you can see down here, the lateral corticospinal tract. And so that's going to be important for conscious control over skeletal muscles. So that lateral corticospinal tract, they're going to cross over. So 85% of them are going to cross over in the pyramids of the medulla, okay, and then they're going to descend down the spinal cord. Whereas the anterior, we have that leftover 15% that's going to stay within that side, and that's going to be important for conscious control over skeletal muscles as well, right? So again, coming from that motor cortex, specifically that precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe, where we have fine motor movement, predominantly of your limbs, right? So if you want to draw, right, this is where you're getting that motor information coming from, right? So if I want to move my right arm, it comes from my left motor cortex, right? And so again, coming down and crossing over to the other side, that decussation at the medulla oblongata, right, which is going to be the lowest part of the brainstem, that's going to be that lateral corticospinal tract, right? And when it's at the level in which it needs to go to, for example, my hand, for me to move, is going to jump over to that ventral gray horn. See, jumping over, as we can see right there. And then it's going to jump out of that ventral root, as you can see right here. And it's going to go to my arm. Sorry, it's going to go to my arm so I can move. Right? Again, helping me with fine motor control. Then we also have subconscious or unconscious, right, motor pathways. So these are going to be those extra pyramidal tracts, right, consisting of 4 tracts involved in monitoring the subconscious motor control, right? So this is indirect pathways for unconscious movements, also for finely tuned conscious movements, right? So we have subconscious and conscious motor commands control over our skeletal muscles through descending motor tracts within the spinal cord. We have the rubrospinal tract, right? The rubrospinal tract is going to be important for fine motor movement, predominantly of the limbs. However, they're going to disappear by the end of the cervical region. This is going to give us an indication of the control over our limbs. We have, and that's going to adjust, again, upper limb position, muscle tone during voluntary movement. We have the reticulospinal and the vestibulospinal tracts. Those are going to be important for posture and balance and like coordinated movement, basically. So head movement, posture, coordinated movement, things like that. And we have the technospinal tract, right? That's going to be important for head movement, eye movement, things like that. Going to respond to visual, auditory stimuli and cues. Okay. Yeah. And these are just different portions of your brain where you have your basal nuclei that's going to modify voluntary and reflexive motor patterns at the subconscious level. Of course, you have your hypothalamus that's going to control reflex motor patterns related to eating, drinking, sexual activity. It's going to modify your respiratory reflexes. You have your pons, your medulla oblongata, superior portion of your medulla oblongata that's going to control reflexes of balance and complex respiratory activity. So your respiratory rhythm centers are going to come from here, right? The medulla oblongata and the pons. Your brainstem and spinal cord is going to simply control cranial and spinal reflexes. Inferior portion of your medulla oblongata is going to control basic respiratory reflexes. Your cerebellum is going to be your small brain or your little brain. It's going to coordinate complex motor patterns unconsciously, right? Your thalamus, your mesencephalon, that's going to control reflexes in your response to visual and auditory stimuli. And your cerebral cortex is going to plan and initiate voluntary motor activity, okay? And that was this chapter, okay?